Hey gang, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, and we're always talking about the Beatles, my favorite subject right here on this channel. With me is a special guest who's been on many times. He's been on this channel. He was, for several years, a co-host of one of my podcast things we said today, and he's also been a guest on the show as well. Was just on, as a matter of fact, with Bruce Spicer, where they were talking about the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' arrival in America. He's also been on my other podcast show, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast, and on my radio show, Every Little Thing. He's been everywhere. And for many years, from just about the very beginning of Beatlefan magazine, he's been a contributing writer, senior editor for the magazine. And he's also the author of a book from several years ago called Changin Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation. We welcome back, proudly, Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. How you doing today?
Pretty good. Well, since we just did a show on things we said today on the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' arrival, this particular show is about another 60th anniversary. And in fact, in the
Mhm.
brand new issue of Beatlefan, you had an article all about this. So,
Well, actually, this particular article won't be in. Will be in the next issue,
okay,
which right comes out in about 2 months.
okay. So this will be a teaser for that
Right.
article, just a few months in advance.
Yeah.
But something that Beatle fans are always happy to bring up in April of every
Mhm.
year is that for the week of April 4th, 1964, the Beatles occupied the top five positions on the Billboard Hot 100. From five
Mhm.
to number one, they were all dominated by the Beatles. It was an amazing feat. And just to tell you all, and I'm sure many of you haven't memorized anyway, what the top five were. Number five was Please Please Me. Number four was I Want to Hold Your Hand. Number three was She Loves You. Number two was Twist and Shout. And the number one song was a song that only debuted the week before on the charts at number 27 and leaped all the way to number one. And
Mhm.
that was Can't Buy Me Love. So Al is going to share his memories of that time, and we're going to have a general conversation about the charts. Michael Ventrella, by the way, who was a guest on this channel a few times, put out this book recently, The Beatles on the Charts. You can also,
Mhm.
at the back of this book, it lists week by week where the Beatles were, the Beatles and the solo Beatles, week by week. Same thing with the albums. So, and even before that, got to give credit to Wally Podrazik and Harry Castleman, who back in the days when they put out their book All Together Now, a chronology of the Beatles and their solo music and US and UK releases and where they were on the charts there. It kind of started from there, and then Michael picked up from that and kept it all the way up until I think it was the end of 2022 in his book.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah. In
back,
in fact, altogether now is approaching its 50th anniversary.
yeah.
It'll It came out in the spring of '75, and I remember just eating that book up.
Uh-huh.
In fact, my copy of it, I made the mistake of trading in the hardcover for the paperback when that was the only one of the three books that came out in paperback, and my copy now is not even it's not even a book. It's now practically a bunch of pages just in a stack. That's
Uh-huh.
how much I've used that book.
That's how my book is at the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I devoured that book myself, and it was a huge influence on me. You would,
Mm-hmm.
how can a chronology be an influence? But in many ways, because they packaged the group and the solo music together, I began to look at it all as one work myself. And because there were several chapters at the end of the book of the original artists of songs that the Beatles covered, the BBC material, the songs the Beatles were involved with for other artists, what I like to call side projects, what they produced, wrote for or played on for other artists. That was all incorporated in one book.
Right. And it had never been tried before.
Yeah. So to me, the Beatles, the solo, Peter and Gordon, David Bowie, it's all
Mm-hmm.
one great big work to me. That's how I tend to look at their entire catalog. But going back to that time, that very special time, especially that first half of 1964, well, this was the week of April 4th. Do you recall, did the media make a big deal about this, about the Beatles having the top 5 singles, or did most radio stations pretty much stick to their own countdown and their own surveys?
Well, the thing is that most of the top 40 stations, they really were ahead of Billboard or
Mm,
Cashbox as well, because Cashbox had the same top five that same week, except that Twist and Shout was number one
huh.
on on their chart, which is, I think, the only time that a cover version by the Beatles was a number one record.
Did it have to?
But but since Billboard is considered pretty much the official chart, that's just incidental.
Well, we'll get
But
into that.
the mhm,
We're going
but
to get into
the
that very subject in a little. And
oh, okay, absolutely. But most of the top 40 stations had really, that kind of chart dominance by the Beatles had been going on for a couple of months
Mhm.
on many of the stations around the country. I mean, I used in the piece, I used WMCA and WABC in New York as examples, but because it was, frankly, because it's easy to look up their surveys,
Mhm.
which is not the case with a lot of other stations. But stations like WLS in Chicago and KHJ in LA and KRLA, and stations around the country, uh, really the Beatles' dominance on their surveys, predated Billboard having I Want to Hold Your Hand officially didn't become number one on Billboard until the week of February 1st. And it it was number one on both. Well, it was number one on WABC the week of April 7th. Excuse me, January 7th.
Right. Well, isn't that the way with most singles? I mean, it takes a while on a national survey for them to
Yeah,
catch up to what other stations. Well, I'm sure they were following. You just mentioned the biggest markets there, New York, LA, Chicago.
sure.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly they're going to follow suit if the biggest markets have them in their top 5 or number one. But still,
Mm-hmm.
for it to go all the way national, it had to take a little bit more time.
In those days, especially, the charts weren't as scientific as they would be beginning in the 90s and
Uh,
beyond. But in those days, it was pretty much, Billboard would basically have, I guess, do a survey of record stores and radio stations. Those were their primary sources,
mhm.
and to see what was selling, and even that was not all that scientific. And with radio stations was mainly what new records were on their surveys each week.
Right. But do you recall? I mean, it's a great thing if locally the Beatles had this kind of dominance, but
Mm-hmm.
national is big time. You can't get better than the national charts and having that kind of
Sure.
dominance. Do you recall
Mm-hmm.
hearing about this, the top 5 as it was happening? Um, was anything
No,
mentioned on the radio or even maybe
no, because
television?
you got to remember that there was no kind of mass market music press in those days.
Yeah.
There was no, especially for rock and roll, because the national media didn't really consider rock and roll to be music. The New York Times, when they would have a review or something that they considered music, it was always classical music.
Hmm.
In fact, I think I mentioned that to Alan on our, the show a couple of weeks ago, that in those days, music was classical music. If there was like a folk music concert, it would be, I think it would be listed under folk, but rock and roll was not, by the standards of the New York Times or any of the other major publications, Time Magazine. They did not consider rock and roll to be music.
So whenever a pop artist achieves something truly great, like a lot of number ones, like the Beatles,
Mm-hmm.
or what Elvis Presley achieved from 1956 on, they didn't make a big deal about that. You never heard another number. This is his fifth number one or anything like that. They didn't really talk about that on a national
No, in
level.
fact, most of the publicity about for Elvis was negative, was about his hip swiveling, and this is
Uh,
going to be the ruination of America. Blah 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 blah. There really, I think probably it was really only radio that would make a big deal of the fact that he had all of these number one records.
right. And I'm sure they
You
did
know,
the same thing with the Beatles.
oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
sure. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, by the middle of the middle of January, uh, Dan Ingram on WABC at 5 o'clock on every afternoon
Hmm.
would play the three Beatles records that were, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Please Please Me, which is all that was available at that point. And and if I remember correctly, he played them consecutively, with not, because their normal format was play a record, couple of commercials, play a record, couple of commercials.
Hmm.
Uh, if I remember correctly, he played all three records consecutively, which was unheard of
Hmm.
on top 40 radio in those days. And by the end of the month, they were playing album cuts, which was, again, absolutely unheard of.
Right. Yeah.
It was all from, if I recall, at least on the surveys, it only lists tracks from Meet the Beatles, not from Introducing the Beatles, interestingly. But just the mere fact that they were playing album cuts was, first of all, it's a reflection of the excellence of the music.
Right.
And I mean, Meet the Beatles is pretty much a perfect album, you know, program wise, and so it wasn't as if they were playing, sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel by playing album cuts by them.
Hmm. Yeah. You
Yeah.
mentioned Cashbox earlier, and I wanted to bring this up, and especially I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
bring it up at the fest because I knew you were going to be on the panel with Michael Ventrella, but you couldn't make it. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you saw the interview that I did with Tony Orlando on my channel, but
Didn't see the whole thing.
okay. But from the very beginning of the interview, and I was happy to mention that Tony Orlando and Dawn had three number one hits. And he immediately corrected me and he said, according to who? And I said, well, Billboard charts, and he was pretty much saying that in the industry they looked at Cashbox more than Billboard as being the authority. Now, it just so happens that Tony's singles performed better on Cashbox, and he had five number ones on Cashbox. Do you remember back in those days in the 60s and even later on in the 70s, how were the two of them viewed? Because I was brought up on American Top 40 with Casey Kasem every single weekend, and I've
Mm-hmm.
said it many times on my shows. And I would write down the top 40 singles every week, and I subscribed to Billboard, and I was always told they were the authority.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones that everybody looked to. So how was it between the two of them? Because every now and then they'll be still on oldie stations. They'll do countdowns that are based on Cashbox and not Billboard. So what
Mm-hmm.
is the major difference between the two?
There really wasn't that much of a difference between the two. They basically covered the same industry topics. but the charts, could be a little different. For instance, um, back when I was working at Sam Goody in the early '70s,
Hmm.
with Mark Lapidus, and we used Cashbox when we did we had a 45 display,
Mm-hmm.
and we would have a copy of the chart right at the kind of like at the head of the display, and we used Cashbox, and the Jackson Five had 6 consecutive #1 singles in Cashbox,
Hmm.
not in Billboard,
Right.
which actually broke the record, because the Supremes had 5 straight #1s between the summer of '64 and pardon me, and the spring of '65.
Right.
So there were subtle differences. It basically, especially like I said, it wasn't scientific in those days. It wasn't as if now Billboard's charts now basically are all computerized. They began using SoundScan
Mm-hmm.
in the early '90s, and then used a company called MediaBase, or a software program called MediaBase, which I know well because it was the one that basically got me retired at ASCAP.
We don't need you anymore.
Right, exactly. And so that MediaBase is and the updates on that are generally what, and I think Nielsen is also involved, is what basically powers the charts now.
Yeah.
But in those days, it was done a lot less scientifically. So that's why there would be subtle differences between their charts, and plus also there was Record World.
Right.
Yeah. Now in 1964, Record World really wasn't considered a major publication, but by the '70s, it was there were the three of them were fairly equal.
But with all the people that you knew in the industry, did they ever, point to one and say that that's really the one? Was it Cashbox contacted Sam Goody, and did Billboard contact Sam Goody?
That I'm not positive of. I think Cashbox may have. Actually, Mark would know better if he remembers, um, because he may have taken calls from one or the other, but I'm not absolutely sure.
Okay.
But they each had kind of like a network of stores that they would contact
Now, I've
and
read
talk.
online, I don't know if this is true, but the Cashbox was more based on sales, whereas Billboard was sales and airplay. Or was it
Um,
also?
that's possible. That's possible that radio may have been more of a factor in Billboard's charts.
Okay.
But again, the differences were fairly subtle.
Now, one thing I wanted to bring up with you was I know that, well, when all this was going on in 1964, I was 4 and a half. And all I remember was hearing Beatles nonstop on my transistor radio.
Sure.
But I know buying the records as I did, certainly the albums and many of the singles. Here was one
Mhm.
record on Capitol Records. Here was another on VJ Records. Here was
Right.
one on Tolly Records. There was one on Swan Records. If you bought My Bonnie, if you cared enough to get My Bonnie, that was on MGM
On
Records.
MGM, right.
If you bought Ain't She Sweet, it was on Atco Records.
On Atco, right.
So I would have been completely confused if it mattered that much to me. Was anything ever explained at that time on the radio why the Beatles were on so many different labels while they're on the charts, dominating the charts as they were?
No, not really, because the top 40 radio, kind of delivery wasn't really conducive to saying, well, the reason why they're on different labels is blah 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 blah. Now that really wasn't explained. It wasn't until sometime later
Hmm.
that, because I didn't even realize that. Pardon me. Didn't even realize that Tolly was a VJ subsidiary until sometime later on. It made sense because all VJ had was in effect, the Please Please Me album, and so introducing the Beatles when they finally released that in January that was all they had, and
Right.
so they kind of, and especially with Capitol, basically trying to sue them out of business. That's really, they had to try to take advantage as much of an advantage as they could. So that's why they released Twist and Shout from the album. That's why they released Love Me Do, which they hadn't even released when it was first available
Right.
in the early part of '63. They hadn't released that until, I guess, was March of '64, and it ended up being a #1 record, which
Okay.
was, of course, very, very ironic.
Yeah. June of '64 hit #1.
Yeah, exactly. Plus the Capital of Canada single of All My Lovin' and Roll Over Beethoven
Hmm.
were getting a lot of airplay as well.
Yeah.
So,
You even included in your article, and again, it's in Michael Ventrela's book. We should also
mhm.
point out that besides taking up the whole top five, the Beatles had 7 more songs on the Hot 100 that week. They had
And
I Saw Her Standing There
mhm.
at 31, From Me to You at 41. Do You Want to Know a Secret? Which a lot of people don't know unless you grew up. That went all the way to #2 in America. That was a
Yeah.
massive hit, you know?
Hmm.
People don't think about that, but if you grew up at that time, got a ton of airplay. All My
Absolutely.
Lovin' was at 58. You Can't Do That was 65. Roll Over Beethoven, you just mentioned, was 68, and Thank You Girl was at 79.
Hmm.
So that's pretty
Yeah.
amazing. 12 songs on the charts back then. And also, I'm happy you mentioned this too. Meet the Beatles and Introducing the Beatles took up the #1 and #2
Right.
position on the album charts. And
Yeah.
that went from February 29th through April 25th. And the only reason why Meet the Beatles was not #1 is because the Beatles' second album
Right.
became the #1 album. And then Meet the Beatles was at #2. So you talk about dominance. They not only had
Hmm.
the top 5 singles that one week, but for that whole period there, the end of February through the end of April, and then beyond that, really,
Sure.
those 2 albums, Meet the Beatles, Beatles' second album, and Introducing the Beatles.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a lull late in the spring and the early summer, but as soon as the soundtrack from A Hard Day's Night came out
Yeah.
in June, it happened all over again because Capitol released 3 singles from the soundtrack, and then plus the Something New album.
Hmm.
So it was the cycle happened basically all over again.
Okay. But there was nothing like that first half of '64, though.
Oh no, those first 4 months, because obviously because of the fact that there was so much of a kind of a catch up
Yeah.
quality because of the fact that the singles that had come out during '63 had been unsuccessful, and then as soon as I Want to Hold Your Hand took off, immediately VJ paired both Please Please Me and From Me to You on one single, and Swan released She Loves You, and it was off to the races.
And VJ really took advantage of what they had on that one album because they
Oh
kept
yeah,
doing it with songs and pictures of the Beatles and
right. And then
versus the
the
Four Seasons and
right, which is really funny because the Four Seasons were VJ was basically an R&B label,
right.
and so and the Four Seasons had their first hits, on their first, I guess, five top 40 hits on VJ, and they were, I think, the first white group that really had any real success
Mm-hmm.
on VJ. But they saw all the problems, all the financial problems that VJ was having. If you can get a copy of it, Bruce Beiser's book on the Beatles on VJ is a real eye opener about what really went on at VJ. But by the end of '63, the Four Seasons were gone.
Right.
Dawn Go Away was their first single on Phillips, and so it was funny that that two record set of the Beatles versus the Four Seasons, was like the one record was the only album that VJ was able to, the only Beatles album that VJ was able to release, and the second disc was their the golden hits of the Four Seasons, which covered just that 1 year of their their five hits, and then scattered album tracks, things like that.
Yeah. I wonder how much a good quality copy of the Beatles versus the Four Seasons is worth, or a mint copy.
Yeah. These days, I don't know. I don't know. You'd probably have to check with the kind of the Uber collectors,
Yeah.
people like that, and see, because it's it's real rare, I'm sure.
Yeah. There weren't too many people that bought it. Didn't chart too high either.
Oh
Surprised,
no.
even though it's using the same material over and over again from the Beatles,
Yeah.
still to combine the two big acts like that,
Hmm.
maybe it would.
Yeah. In fact, if I recall, I got it at the same time that I got the Beatles Story,
Hmm.
which was the documentary that the Capitol put out in the fall of '64.
Yep. I bought that too.
Hmm.
The last time I listened to it, though.
Well, it's a nice little kind of memory bank, if you will, time capsule. That's what
Right.
I'm thinking of. It's a nice little time capsule of what that first year was like, because the script from it basically came from one of the teen magazines.
Hmm.
Because I remember when I listened to it, I'm thinking, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. And sure enough, it went back to one of those special edition magazines that had come out during the earlier in the year. And sure enough, the profiles of each Beatle were taken largely from those from like that magazine.
Yeah. Well, in those days, they try to capitalize, no pun,
Oh yeah.
as much as possible.
Oh
Um,
sure.
I covered this with Michael when I had him on the show, but I want your take on this because
Hmm.
it always baffled me. You take a look at the charts in the 60s, not just with the Beatles, but the songs on the charts weren't there very long. Very often you'll have a
Hmm.
single like I pointed out, Can't Buy Me Love. Can't Buy Me Love was only on the charts for 10 weeks.
Hmm.
5 of those weeks they were at number one. It just was completely off the charts as soon as it went up the charts. And in the decades that followed, singles stayed on the charts for a long time.
Sure.
So what was the reasoning behind that? Do you know why the charts were so different back then?
I think part of it was simply the surveying that the trades did of record stores and radio, especially radio, because I the there were songs that really were not in heavy rotation
Mhm.
as long as they would be later on. And so I think that's probably the main reason why the song something like "Can't Buy Me Love" was you may know for sure how many weeks it was actually on the Hot 100.
Yeah, it was 10 weeks.
You know, it
And,
was
and
just 10 weeks. Yeah,
yeah, and 5 weeks of that was at number one.
right.
So as
Yeah,
soon as it left number one, it was on the charts 4 more weeks then.
yeah.
That's because it only took 2 weeks to get to number one.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember spending a lot of time on the radio, and top 40 stations would have what they called recurrence.
Right.
So those would be songs that were recently hits that they were still playing. So maybe in the 60s they didn't have that as much
Uh,
at
well,
all, you know.
like a station like WABC did, because
Hmm.
basically most of the hits, and of course they, as by 65, 66, their playlist had really shrunk. Um, but there were things that were on their playlist that would fall off the survey, and like a week or so later, it would be back on as new gold.
Okay, well,
You know,
it still is. I find it all fascinating, and I'm wondering if maybe part of the reason was that singles kept coming out so quickly that when a
that
new
too.
single came out, then the last single was already old news.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Because groups released, especially the major groups, they
Hmm.
basically were basically told by the record companies, we need new product.
Mhm.
And that's why, let's face it, in 1964, the Beatles had 6 number 1 singles.
Right.
That's a lot of number 1 singles in one year.
Plus, A World Without
You
Love
know,
was number one too, Peter and Gordon. So another
yes,
McCartney song
yeah.
was,
So sure, exactly. So there were 7 Lennon McCartney songs that were number 1 during that year, which is just unheard of.
do you recall how much was made of whatever connections there were between Billy J. Kramer, Peter and Gordon with the Beatles? Did they ever say that on the radio?
Um, Eventually, like in when World Without Love was first getting onto radio playlists, um, um, I think, if I recall correctly, I think the DJs would begin saying, this was written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney,
Hmm.
and certainly that was the case with most of Billy J's singles, except for Little Children.
Right.
You know,
But they would
but
say that on the radio, and that would
occasionally, but again, it kind of like it depended on the disc jockey, and it depended on their top 40 patter and that sort of thing.
yeah,
You know, they figured they weren't really there to dispense information.
right. It was more it wasn't an educational show.
Yeah,
It was more
exactly. It wasn't.
entertaining.
Yeah, it wasn't. It wasn't like when rock on FM started
Right.
in '67. and the personalities there would give out a little bit more in the way of information
Hmm.
about about the acts they were playing.
So when exactly did this event of occupying the top five really become something that we started to talk about every year? When was
It
it something
it
that was really noticed later on?
it um, probably wasn't until the 70s when All Together Now came out, and other books. Yeah, it really wasn't especially during the Beatles years as a group in the 60s. It really wasn't. I don't think most people even knew about it.
Yeah.
You know,
On my shows, I love to talk about the charts and all the different
sure,
accomplishments that the Beatles have done. The same thing with having 20 number one singles. I
sure,
mention it all the time. Was that
yeah.
only something that was brought up later on, like in the 70s, just like this?
Um, Eventually, yeah, but also, a lot of people, a lot of the more casual fans, they really didn't care,
Hmm.
what was on if they knew anything about charts at all, it was like their local radio station charts.
Right.
Like most people didn't really subscribe. Most, you know, um, what I would call rank and file fans didn't really subscribe to
Hmm.
Billboard or Cashbox, um, because for one thing, they were too expensive.
Yeah, that's true.
You
But
know,
for someone like myself to have American Top 40 on the radio every week, that was my way of finding out.
yeah, yeah,
And,
exactly,
my passion for learning this stuff is no different than sports fans studying statistics
right,
with their athletes. Not
absolutely,
everybody's that heavily into it,
sure,
you know.
exactly. Nobody, people who used to pour over even before all the computerization of it and analytics and all of that. People used to pour over the copies of the Sporting News to get box scores, and whereas most fans really didn't really pay that much attention.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I just find it all very fascinating. All
Mm-hmm.
these incredible accomplishments that were done, top 10 hits, number one hits, hits that, as far as songwriting accomplishments, not just recording accomplishments, everything
Right,
like that. I just, not that the most successful are necessarily the best, but it's interesting to find out
right.
it's ranked
Mm-hmm.
for me anyway. Um,
Exactly. But the one thing that got to make a point about is that the charts now
uh,
are hugely different
I know.
from what they were back then, because especially now, really streaming is probably the higher weight of all of the elements that make up the charts now. Streaming, downloads, and radio airplay sales is pretty much, I don't even think that's taken into consideration anymore.
Oh, it is. No, I've read
Maybe.
a lot about it, but the thing is, any physical sales count far more than a stream.
Mm,
But when you've
yeah,
got millions of streams compared to
right,
thousands of CDs and LPs, um, the streaming figures more into the whole equation more than
yeah,
anything else. And that's
right.
why when McCartney 3 came out and
Hmm.
high as number two was beaten out by Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift had
Hmm.
far more streams, having a
Right.
younger audience than Paul, but Paul
Hmm.
sold more, I guess, in vinyl and CDs, but it's still
Yes.
enough in the total tabulation of things, because if you have millions of streams, that could put you ahead of someone that has decent sales and physical sales.
Yeah.
That's just the way that it is.
Hmm.
There has to be a way of tabulating everything. I mean, you've got to count streaming in some ways. Streaming is the equivalent of airplay in many ways, because
Hmm. Sure.
on their own volition, they're choosing what they want to hear. So
Hmm.
you got to figure that into the equation in some way. So
Oh,
it is very different.
hmm. But people like, for instance, on social media, who get all outraged about the fact that Taylor Swift has had so much success on
Mhm.
the charts, and really has almost eclipsed that accomplishment of having the top 5 singles.
Mm.
um, and you have to kind of explain to them it's a different ball game.
Mhm.
It's not, they're not comparable at all. Because because there will be, in a given week, there might be, especially when Taylor Swift or Beyonce or one of any of the current pop artists,
Mm.
if they release a new album, basically every track on the album will make the charts, because either through streaming or downloads, or radio airplay and
Right.
all. So it's not the same as it was 60 years ago.
Not only that, but the streaming and the downloads, the record companies don't even have to make a physical product.
Exactly.
There's no
Right.
effort there on their part other than promoting the music.
Right.
But, in the days of the Beatles, people went out and bought the records.
Sure. That was the only way to get it. It would, so that's why I think a lot of people of, certainly people um, you know, of my generation and the Gen Xers and all, are so devoted to, the physical product. And it's these days you really don't, unless you have to, from a collector's point of view, you have to have the physical product.
Mhm.
In a lot of cases, you really don't need the physical product. You can just go to Spotify, go to Apple Music, and put these albums, or singles or EPs, whatever,
Right.
in your library.
I know
You
it's a
know,
whole other world now, but
yeah,
for older people like ourselves, we kind of look at the physical sales as what really counts.
I suppose, but given what the formulation is now,
Hmm.
it I don't really have a problem with the fact that contemporary artists are having so much success with streaming and all, that it's not physical product, but
Hmm.
others are.
No, I don't have a problem with it either. But,
Yeah.
and digital sales are still sales, still
Sure.
spending money on it. So
Right.
anyway, I wanted to ask you, since as I said in 1964, I certainly wasn't following the charts, and I was just listening
Sure.
to the radio as a rabid fan, music fan, loved top
Hmm.
40 back then. And what I can relate to was the dominance of the Bee Gees. And
Right.
you wrote about that in your article. And
Right. Because
what the Bee Gees achieved was pretty extraordinary. It's not the top five
hmm.
necessarily, but between what they were doing and also with what they were writing with other people, for other
Right.
people, Andy Gibb's success, Barbara Streisand with Barry Gibb, and
Well, that was a little
Warwick with the
later.
Beat. I know, but I'm just saying
Mhm.
that they had so much success, and even before Barbara Streisand, there was Andy Gibb, there was Samantha Sang with Emotion,
Right.
stuff from Saturday Night Fever, Yvonne Elliman. It was pretty amazing how they really dominated at that time. How
Right.
would you compare what they did then with what the Beatles were doing?
Um, it's I mean, it's similar, but it's obviously not the same, because the Beatles having the top 5 singles,
Hmm.
and it was the Beatles. It was,
Right.
whereas it was in the first 2 weeks of April of 1978. The Bee Gees had the I think the top two singles with "Staying Alive" and "Night Fever,"
Hmm.
and Yvonne Elliman with "If I Can't Have You," Samantha Sang, as you mentioned, with "Emotion," and Andy Gibb with uh, "Love Is Thicker Than Water."
Okay.
And those five songs were the five in the top of the top eight, and that's in the pre, the pre-download streaming era, the
Right.
pre-computerized era. That's the closest that any artist or any songwriters have come to that kind of dominance.
Yeah. And in some ways, this is not taking anything away from the Beatles, but when it comes to writing for other people, the Beatles, for the most part at that time, wrote for their friends, Billy J. Kramer and Peter and Gordon, Billy J., Cilla Black, people in Brian Epstein's stable of artists. The Bee Gees wrote for other people, and granted, they were superstars, it wasn't
Right,
as
but
tough to sell Barbara Streisand, that it was Billy J. Kramer or someone like that. But it's really impressive how much they wrote for other people and how successful they were at that. They had to write for other people at a time when there was a backlash towards the
well,
Beatles.
that's the thing. That after the disco backlash
Right.
in '79, and plus also the Sgt Pepper movie with Peter
Mm.
Frampton didn't help matters. And because I just watched it about a week or so ago,
Uh,
and it hasn't aged well. Let's put it that way.
it's been a while
It's as
since I watched it, and it's light entertainment. Peter Frampton didn't he needed acting lessons, I think, but
well, yeah. I mean, none of them were actors, but then
yeah,
they really didn't have to act
right.
as such.
Hmm.
um but it's pretty, other than the Earth, Wind and Fire, Got to Get You Into My Life,
Hmm.
Aerosmith doing Come Together, Billy Preston doing Get Back, and Steve Martin doing
Maxwell
Maxwell
Silverhammer,
Silver. Yes. Other than
like
that,
that version.
it's great. But other than that, the movie is awful. But the combination of that and the disco backlash, pretty much, I mean, it did a lot of damage to the Bee Gees' career, at least as a group, and Peter Frampton, as a matter of fact.
I think with the Bee
You know,
Gees, it had a lot more to do with saturation of airplay. I mean,
yeah,
we
but
went through the
the
same thing later with Phil Collins, because Phil Collins was everywhere between Genesis,
right,
his solo music, and
right,
all the people that he worked with other artists. And the Bee Gees worked with so many other artists that I
right.
think, it was
But
very
I
fortunate, that they were able to find the success that they did with Barbra Streisand and Dionne Warwick,
right,
that those are
but
two superstars.
right, but the real problem was the is that they were unfairly, because they were not a disco group,
Right.
but they were unfairly pigeonholed as being a disco group.
Hmm.
And when disco went out of favor, in the latter part of '79 and then in '80, their airplay just nosedived. And so they really had no other recourse but to kind of spread out as songwriters
Hmm.
and producers, you know so especially in the '80s, where they had a lot of success as songwriters.
Hmm.
But it was like a decade before they had another top 10 hit in this country. And in England, I think it was '87 before they had another top 10 record,
Hmm. Yeah.
you know, as a group.
Right. So talented.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I'm partial to, because their first album
Hmm.
that came out in the summer of '67, I've always said was like getting a second Sgt. Pepper. It was that good.
Mm.
And the second album, Horizontal, was nearly as good. It's that their early stuff, is just that's that's my BG's music.
Okay. I like both. I love the early
Mm-hmm.
years, especially. Um, and they're so great at ballads too. That's
Oh, absolutely.
Run to Me, is one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite songs by them.
Sure.
How do you view, I mean, we talked about the charts today, but one of the big changes that I found, I don't know whether to rejoice in this or to frown on it, is how Christmas music is treated now. Because now every year, the end of every year, all the classic Christmas stuff is on the charts, on the Hot 100. Brenda Lee just had a #1 hit with Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, and I'm happy for her.
Sure.
But, in the days when Happy Christmas came out, Wonderful Christmas Time, they didn't make the Hot 100. Okay. There
Correct.
was a Christmas chart then, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But only went on those charts, even if it sold enough that where it could have made the Hot 100.
Mm-hmm.
So now every year, thankfully, Happy Christmas and Wonderful Christmas Time reemerge on the Hot 100. They don't chart too high, but they have some showing on the charts. But it's kind of like, why are you changing the rules here?
Well, the thing is that was long before, back in those days. Basically, radio would play. They really wouldn't start playing, especially top 40 stations, wouldn't start playing Christmas music until about 2 weeks before Christmas, and they would just kind of like weed it in with the rest of the format.
Right.
And then usually like on Christmas Eve, like it's say noon or 1 o'clock on Christmas Eve, they would start playing all Christmas. Then in the 90s, I guess it was in the, yeah, I guess it was
Mm,
the early 90s, when stations like WLTW, Light FM in New York,
yeah.
began playing, the 24/7 Christmas, all Christmas format that now starts practically in the first week in November.
Right.
And the problem with that is that it's a very narrow format, in that the playlist, the heavy rotation playlists are very um are very small, maybe like 200 songs,
Hmm.
and so that's why you constantly hear um Wonderful Christmas Time, the Ronettes doing Sleigh Ride,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because of that airplay, that once streaming came in, that every year you'd have those songs starting to make the upper reaches of the charts. I mean, it's been what, 25 years since Mariah Carey's "All I Want for Christmas Is You" first came out, and it had reached #1 on the Hot 100. I forget how many times
Many.
in the last 25 years,
Yeah.
and then finally this past year, Brenda Lee was able to get finally to the top of "Rocking Around the Christmas Tree."
Right.
You know, but it's it's weird. It's a it's it, you know there's so you know there's so many other great Christmas records that have come out
Right.
over the years, and to just play the same ones over and over and over again with the attitude, apparently, because I saw this is years ago, saw an interview with Jim Ryan, who was the public
Program director.
program director. That's what it's, program director at Light FM and later at CBS FM. And he said that the attitude is that if people tune in and they hear a song, even if it's even a version of a classic Christmas song, but it's by somebody that they don't like, they're going to change the dial.
Hmm.
So they have to play the same songs over and over and over again.
Oh, that's funny, because when I listen to the Christmas music around that time, there's a lot of cover versions, of certain songs that I hear.
Right.
I don't know how to react to this, because if you want to swear by the charts, it's hard to justify them when you've got all these classic songs from the past that didn't chart back then for the reasons you gave. I understand why,
right.
Why. But at the same time, it's the only time you're ever going to hear Andy Williams on the radio.
Oh yeah.
Or Burl
sure.
Ives,
Especially all of these artists who are, let's face it, are no longer with us.
Right.
And you couldn't get stations like the stations that have these 24/7 Christmas formats. You couldn't get them to play anything by those artists
right.
that are not Christmas music at gunpoint,
right?
Because they're not consistent with the format.
Yeah.
So it's strange.
Don't you just love radio?
Yeah.
So let's just end this conversation by asking you, how do you see the importance of the charts overall? How important is it to you? What does it represent to you?
Well, okay. Contemporaneously, it really doesn't mean much to me at all, because of as what we were talking about before, the fact that from week to week, like for instance, this country artist Morgan Wallen has spent more weeks at number one than any. Now I'm not sure. This is the album. I believe his second album has spent more weeks at number one than any, and I'm not sure if this is including pop, but it's more weeks at number one than any artist supposedly since Garth Brooks in the early 90s. Which is right about the beginning of the SoundScan era.
Okay.
So, but what does that matter? It's especially because radio formats are so fragmented that you're never going to hear a Morgan Wallen on, say, Z100 in New York.
Right.
That so the charts really don't really mean that much to me now, but back in the 60s, and really it was more the radio station surveys. I would the story that I've told about the first time that I heard "I Want to Hold Your Hand" was because every Tuesday night Scott Muni would play the top 7 songs on WABC at 8:00, and I had been listening for going back a couple of years at least every Tuesday night, and continued as time went on. So at least the radio station surveys meant a lot more to me back then than the charts do now.
Hmm.
As far as like the national charts, I really didn't have access to them really until the 70s. Until I started working in record stores.
Yeah. Well, I can relate to everything you're saying there, even going back further since you mentioned Garth Brooks.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who listened to a lot of formats of radio but didn't really listen to country, Garth Brooks was having all the success and number one albums and number one songs on the country charts, and I never knew any of them because they
Mm-hmm.
weren't played on the stations that I listened to. So
Sure.
it was much easier for artists back in the 60s, 70s, even the 80s to have an impact if they were played on a variety of formats, whereas Garth Brooks was really only played on country radio.
Sure. Well,
You know,
especially in the 60s where top 40 would play whatever was popular.
right.
So if you heard on WABC, you could hear, say, around 1966, you would hear the beat in like a half hour. You'd hear the Beatles and James Brown and Frank Sinatra
Hmm.
and the Statler Brothers
Right.
and on and on. Whereas now it's never the twain shall meet because there are so many different formats and everything is very fragmented that as for instance as usually popular as Taylor Swift is now,
Mm.
there are a lot of people that are more into that they listen to classic rock or even like contemporary rock, have basically never heard anything by her,
I know.
which is why something as huge as the Beatles, an act that would have the impact that the Beatles had, it simply would not happen today.
Yeah, well, top 40 was just so different in the 60s and 70s, and it really was a major influence on me in
Sure.
developing the eclectic music taste that I have.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this many times here. In the heart of that time when the Beatles in the first half of 1964, when they were dominating the charts, Hello Dolly by Louis Armstrong was a number
Right.
one hit.
Right.
That would never happen today. And Frank Sinatra in his 50s was having hits in the 60s.
Right.
Perry Como had a hit with It's Impossible in the early 70s.
In the early
That
70s.
you'd never have anybody like that in that age group today because it is a youth-oriented market. And that's one of the things why I think the charts are important to me is because it's a true reflection of how the public responded when a young audience was exposed to the music.
Right.
Okay. There's a huge difference between if Paul McCartney releases an album today, it could chart high in the beginning and then it drops off the charts after a month to 2 months. That's because all the older people who grew up with him, a few young people, love his
Mm-hmm.
music. They go out, they know about it, they go out and they buy it. But all the radio stations that cater to young people are not going to play it. So the only way that any of that stuff is going to have staying power is if young people hear it. So that's why most of the stuff that sells in massive quantities, whether it's streaming or digital or physical, why they stay on the charts as long as they do is because it's aimed towards young people. So when all these singles did well by the Beatles in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, when it was played to young people, that's how they responded. That's a true reflection, more so
Mm-hmm.
than what a veteran artist will put out today, whether or not, if that music, I don't care whether it's Paul or Ringo or Eric Clapton, Elton John, Rod Stewart, if it's played to young people, however it performs on the charts would be more of an accurate, honest reflection of how they feel about it. But if they're not
Mm-hmm.
hearing it, then it can't be that accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So, I used to always hear it's what was it Victor Spinetti said in A Hard Day's Night? It's a young man's medium. It's true.
Sure.
It takes you a long time before you realize it. But
Yeah. Well, as for instance, as much of an occasion as it was when Now and Then debuted in early November, it really, except for the 1 week when I believe it debuted at number 7.
Yep.
It really did not make, it wasn't a hit record, in the way that that contemporary artists have, consistent hits.
Right. Yeah, well, that just proves my point.
Yeah.
It got a lot of media attention, definitely.
Right.
It was all over the internet. But as
Mhm.
far as radio, they're not going to play a Beatles song.
No.
Stations that cater to young people. And
Right.
even, I like to point this out, this is going back to when the Beatles anthology came out, and Paul McCartney was writing to the BBC because they refused to play Real Love. Because
Mhm.
they felt their audience was too old.
Right.
The Beatles audience was too old, and the young folks are not going to care about a Beatles record.
Mhm.
Although it is pretty ironic now that Now and Then did as well as it did in the UK, because it
Yeah.
was number one.
Right.
So I don't know what the change was there, but I know here that's just how it is. It's almost impossible for any veteran artist to do really well. You can chart high, but you're not going to have
Mhm.
staying power, So, but what happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to me was more of a real reflection of how the young people felt at that time when they heard all this music.
Sure.
So that's just how
Yeah.
I feel anyway.
Yeah, because that was the era of, the mass market radio stations, and
Hmm.
you're really, because even like, today's, contemporary hit radio, they're only playing, a very narrow, they'll play the pop artists, they'll play the Taylor Swifts and
Hmm.
Beyonces and all, and some hip hop. That's about it. They really don't play any other kinds of music.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons why, what we know as rock and roll has, really been backgrounded.
Yeah. Well, any of the real core rock artists, if they're lucky, they'll get some airplay for a few weeks with a new album, like Paul does.
Right.
He gets some airplay. The Rolling Stones got a decent amount of airplay with their last album, but again,
Right. But even current rock groups
yeah,
don't get, and I'm not talking about, and when it seems like in some circles, when there's a current rock group, they think, oh, Green Day,
uh-huh,
or who is, I mean, they're a fine band, but
right,
they're not a new band.
right,
But even like new, fairly successful rock
right.
bands now get zero airplay on, CHR stations.
Oh, CHR, yeah, but AAA stations, yes, that's where you
Yeah,
have
to
to
some
find.
to some extent, but even, I mean, Darren DeVivo, your
Uh-huh.
colleague on Things We Said Today, can tell you that, that, a lot of the, rock music that's played on AAA stations, a lot of that is, again, Stone Temple Pilots and Pearl Jam and Nirvana,
Well,
music
I,
from 30 years ago.
I listen to WFUV when I'm in the car, and I listen to WEHM, which is on Long Island, and they're a AAA
Mhm.
station. It's a lot of new rock that they play that I'm
Oh,
impressed
okay.
with.
Well, that's
So,
all good.
I try to listen to some new stuff, but I don't really get into what gets played on CHR Contemporary Hit Radio. I
Right.
think there's a lot of good new rock that's out there, but it will never have the same impact for me as what I grew up listening to as
Oh,
a
no,
teenager. A
no,
lot
no.
of it has to do with, how old you are when you hear this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the saying that the music that you listen to when you were 14 is the music that you'll basically have will stay with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, I would say as a little
And
kid through your early 20s, not just 14.
mhm,
Uh, for me, I mean, you like to point out 14, and it just so happens that when I was 14, it was 1973, which is my
1973,
favorite solo Beatle year. But that
right?
doesn't mean it's my overall favorite year in music. But I
Hmm.
do probably like the first half of the 70s the best,
Hmm.
me personally. So, and I'm not saying that because disco came around and, and dominated a lot of the 70s because I like a lot of disco too. But, it is true that I think for most people, not everybody, they have about 1 or 2 decades of music that means everything in the world to them. And they might like a few other things later, but it will never have the same impact, and you'll never have the same emotion connected
Hmm. Sure.
with later music that you had with earlier music from your youth. It's just the way it is for all humans, you know. It's just the way that I feel. And I like talking to people about music in general, not just the Beatles.
Hmm.
You'll
Sure.
find that's how, and it doesn't have to be the new music of the time. You could be a teenager right now and totally absorb the 60s or the 70s or something. It's what you
Oh
hear
yeah.
at that age that matters.
And plus it's what you're exposed to, because there are a lot of young people that were exposed to Beatles music or 60s and 70s music
Hmm,
almost from the time they were in the womb, and have kind of grown up with that music.
right,
But then there are others that are never exposed to that music.
right,
The only stuff they heard as little kids was you know what what their the what mom played in the on the radio in the car,
uh-huh,
which was generally top 40, or CHR, whatever, and so they you know, they have no idea who the Beatles were
hmm.
in a lot of cases.
I know it's shocking
And
to many people,
yeah.
but it's true. That's why I'm so grateful that not only was I brought up on Top 40 radio, but my parents, I heard the music that they loved from big band music, Glenn Miller,
Oh, absolutely.
Benny
Yeah.
Goodman, and I heard the Frank Sinatras and Dean Martins and the whole Rat Pack and you know, Harry Belafonte. I was exposed to all this stuff, and I'm really grateful
Hmm.
that I was because it gave me such a deep appreciation for so many different types of music.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But anyway, this has been great talking about this very special time of the week of April 4th, 1964. And I want to remind everybody, Al has an article coming out, not, well, in every issue you have a new article anyway, right?
Hmm.
Okay.
Right. Pretty much.
In Beatlefan, but the one on when the Beatles dominated the charts there with the top five will be in the next issue after the current one, right?
Right.
Well, okay. So thanks so much for doing this, Al. And thanks to all of you for watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. And I'm sure Al's going to be popping up on my channel some more and on the other podcast, things we said today and Talk More Talk, probably two legs as well. So thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.